Yes, Pete Oakes and I have been friends for most of life. When I first met in the mountains just above here at summer camp under the glory of Longest Peak, I was drawn to him. Even at 10 years old, I saw a kindness, an integrity, a seriousness of heart and mind. And a few years later, in fact, many years later, that's still Pete, further up and further in. And then the strange wonders of Providence, 50 years later, we found ourselves committed to the same commitments, having the same hopes, giving our lives for the same beliefs. A surprise, perhaps, but this is the second time in a month he and I have come to Colorado to speak on this question, the business of business. In every way, it's a gift to stand beside my long friend here today, Pete. Thank you. I'm a native son, a true native, born under the majesty of the Sangre de Cristos, the blood of Christ mountains that run along the San Luis Valley. My first memories are from the corner of Colorado where the mesas meet the mountains. A few hours further west between Durango and Cortez, a unique place where the four states touch, becoming the four corners for many people all over the world. I rode my first calf there, my first horse, ate my first frog legs there, and I learned to pray under the shadows of Mesa Verde. There's a generational history of colorful Colorado. As a boy, my three great-aunts lived on Pearl Street, not so far from here on the DU campus. My mother and her four sisters went to Greeley High School, where their uncle was the principal. Woven into my family's history are the family farming corporations of Greeley and Denver, whose ambitions and hard work made their way into the building of airports and baseball teams here in the Mile High City. And most every Monday morning in my boyhood summers, I came with my grandfather to the Denver stockyards, a consuming universe of passions for me. The cattle in Colorado were his business. Took him all over the state, from Brush to Greeley to Fort Collins, northern Colorado, and to Cortez and Durango in the southwestern corner. In most every way, it's a world of work that's come and gone, at least as it once was. But through many years, I was formed and shaped in my soul by my grandfather's loves, by the commitments that ran through his life. He loved Colorado, and I did too. The world that was his, I wanted to be mine. Looking back, I can see that central to everything in his life was the belief that what he prayed for on his knees, night by night, had to play out in the work of his life day by day. Wherever that took him, both to know his work well, but also to do his work well, with unusual and surprising integrity, trusted by the cattle buying and selling community of Colorado. And though he did not know of Saint Benedict, the words brought his community together in 5th century Italy, course through my grandfather's life in the 20th century. Ora e labora. Make sure all this is right now. Ora e labora, to pray and to work. Not to pray or work, but to pray and work together, seamlessly bringing forth one's truest life out of one's deepest loves. The question before us this morning is an ancient question, one running through the centuries and cultures. Sons of Adam and daughters of Eve that we are, asking again, is it possible to honestly love God and to work in the world too? We have a long history of thinking otherwise, actually, as people have thought. All over the US, Canada, Mexico, North America, Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, in the Middle East, India, Asia, wherever I've gone, really, watching lists of people who are like you in the world, we stumble over this business of that question, not answering it very well at all. Some years ago, I was teaching in Vancouver, British Columbia, at a place called Regent College. I was the professor of marketplace theology, it's called. And I taught all kinds of people from all kinds of places. And one of them was a woman and her husband from Sydney, Australia. And they were business people that come to Vancouver for a week at the summertime. My course on the book Visions of Vocation was the week's class topic. At the end of the week, the woman said to me, "Can I talk to you before we finish today?" I said, "Sure." At the break that morning, she said, "I just wanted to say to you that I had a question for years in my life, and I've never been able to really get a good answer for. I've asked friends, and I haven't had a good answer to the question. She said, but I think you've answered that question for me this week. I said, well, what was the question? She said, I've never been able to figure out the relationship between my Christian life and then my life. My Christian life and then my regular life. My Christian life and the rest of my life. I said, what do you think now? She said, I think they're the same thing, aren't they? Well, John Newton had a problem with this too. He was a runaway from his family, went off to Africa, got involved in the slave trade, eventually became a slave trade captain. Spent years of his life taking hundreds and hundreds and thousands of manacled slaves across what was called the Middle Passage from Africa to the New World of North America. One day he opened up a chest on board the ship, and he found a Bible in it and began to read the Bible in a surprising moment in his life, and somehow by the amazing grace of God had a repentant moment in his life. Called out to God for salvation and kept trading slaves for years after that. In fact, he'd have Bible studies on the top deck of the slave ships with hundreds of manacled, dying slaves beneath him. Bible studies on the top deck, people dying below him. And he saw no relationship between his prayer and his work. Between, in fact, what he said he believed to be most true in the universe and how he actually worked out his life in the world of work. And years later, about 32 years later, in fact, as I read his history, there's a letter that I've seen, and it says essentially, I was a part of a horrible, horrible, horrible thing many years ago in my life. It'd be a more simple story, wouldn't it, if we could just say, well, he read the Bible, repented, said, God saved me, wrote Amazing Grace, and met William Wilberforce, and the whole world was changed. It'd be a better story to tell, actually. But it's a more complex, messy story. And I would say to you, brothers and sisters, for his life and for my life, it's a complex, messy world, isn't it? I don't disdain him for this, because I would say that, like him, I have a disposition to dualism. A disposition to dualism. I think if we're going to be people who move away from that in life, it would require a deeper, harder work of thinking it all through, of asking the more critical questions, pressing in for what is real, for what is true, and what is right in the marketplaces of life. The Mile High City is the capital city of the Rocky Mountain region, no longer a central city for livestock and the stockyards. But now Denver and Colorado is more business and healthcare, oil and gas, with technology of every kind, and always and everywhere, butchers, bakers, bankers, and candlestick makers, spread across the city and along the Front Range. Your local teams, the Rams, the Buffaloes, the Broncos, still echo that older history, but you've moved on in most every way. There's a family whose entrepreneurial and economic vision has become a significant influence on the life and times of Denver and Colorado, over time developing many interests now represented in healthcare and hospitality along the Front Range, as well as many other business interests. Among faces of their love for this place and its people are the signs at DIA, Denver International Airport, asking the thousands who come and go through the airport day after day to remember the virtues that make for human flourishing. Yes, that make for the flourishing of this city and of our society. If we have ears to hear and eyes to see, we will. They call it the foundation for a better life. The foundation for a better life. Because I've watched this work over the years of its life, because I fly in and out of Denver a lot and come here as often as I can to Colorado. I thought, so what would it be if you had financial resource, you had a vision for hope and the way of life in the world? Would you imagine something like this? That, just put it kind of crudely, it could be like, and Jesus saved you from your sin, walking through DIA, John 3:16. It could be that. But what if you didn't want to do it that way? That you still had those deepest of convictions that God does save us from sin. How would you, if it's not saving grace, how would it be worked out if we could call it common grace for the common good? Is that a possibility? Is that a possibility? Could you actually argue for a way to see your life in the world that actually draws you to your true end as a human being? Is that a possibility? I think we all know there's a confession of honest faith that runs deep in this family, a Trinitarian commitment to God and history that's what the centuries have called mere Christianity. But that's what one believes about the things that matter most. What do we do with that in the world? The only categories we have are my Christian life and the rest of life, my personal faith in the public world, of a sacred life and a secular life, or of ora or labora. And the signs make no sense to us, falling in on themselves, everyone wondering, what? Why? Nice for you, maybe, perhaps, but not for me in the real world where I have to live. If we're going to move out and away from that dualism, we need a theology that can make sense of common grace. And while I won't say more about that here, much more could be said. What I do believe in, though, is the task of translation. The task of translation. I've been asking the question for years and years. First began in Nashville with musicians, and then other parts of America and the world, people who were in the music world, who were people of honest faith. They didn't want to sing songs only for Christian people. Sing songs for everybody, in fact. There's a band here in Denver some years ago that I got to know very well. They went all over the country and the world, and we used this language talking about their work too in those years. Can you sing songs shaped by the truest truths of the universe in a language the whole world can understand? Is that a possibility? Is that a possibility? I saw there was an honest question for all of us instead. All of us living in an ever more pluralizing, secularizing society, where most of us who live and work and have our being in this world, actually, they don't see life in the world like we do. They don't live like we do. Can we be persuasive? Can we be leaven, offering visions of vocation that are windows into reality, into the way of the world really is, in the way things must be for all to flourish, for our cities and societies are to flourish? Some years ago, I was invited to a breakfast in the Washington, D.C. area with two executives from the Mars Corporation. This guy and this guy, they were in senior positions of influence, and they had a question to talk about. We talked about it for 2 hours. I asked questions and questions and questions, but why this question? And what about this? And where's this come from? And finally, I heard that one of the owners of the Mars Corporation, which is a family-owned company 100 years later, had asked the chief economist a question which we were meeting to discuss that morning. How much money should you make this year? You think, well, isn't it obvious? Why is it even a question? But you see, for that Mr. Mars, the question was, we want to keep being a prosperous business, to use Pete's questions language, a prosperous business. We want to keep making money. Never ever was in this conversation the question, how can we begin to give away M&Ms to the world? No, in fact, you want to keep making more and more billions again this next year. But the question was, for a family-owned, privately held company, how do you sustain profitability? That's the harder question. How do you keep making money? We talked about Milton Friedman that morning, his idea of what business is about. Sole business is what? And purpose is what? And we said, no, it can't be that way. If you want to keep making money, Friedman doesn't give you enough questions to ask, actually. We talked about more profitability that morning, more resiliency over time. We began in Nairobi and in Manila as a starting points, two very, very impoverished places, the largest ghetto or impoverished, how do we describe it? Poorest, the poor in Nairobi, the garbage dump city in Manila. Wanted to say, well, let's talk this out actually in the hardest of all places. Could we rethink the business of business, not where it's easier to do with people like this who've been there and have studied here, but let's go to the hardest of the places to say, could we rethink the nature of the bottom line, the more complex line, in this most difficult of places in the world? We've talked for years now about the mutual value creation over against simply a profit maximization. There's now, after 15 years of work on this, a partnership with Oxford University's Business School. There's a headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, which is working on this question all over the world. The people who work on this, wherever I watch them, listen to them, and talk to them, they're seriously invested in the most seriously important issues of life in the world. There is a more complex bottom line written into this vision of the Jubilee of God, which is where we began our conversation. When I said, where does this come from you? Why are you asking a question like this? And one of them said to me, he was the chief economist, he said, well, I've been thinking about the Jubilee of God for 20 years of my life now. I'm wondering, could we work out this biblically born idea in the modern world, the globalized political economy, where it's simply the Bible says that, and we live here, and yes, I need to be nice, I need to be honest, but in terms of how we think about business, I don't think the Bible speaks about that, actually. We've given it 15 years now trying to think through what an idea like the Jubilee of God means for the way we do business in the world. You see, the Jubilee of God is a vision which is written into the very reality of the way the world is really there. Whether we want it to be or not, whether we believe it to be true or not, but by great grace, it's a window into reality, into what is and what isn't true about life in the world. We've met this morning with the advertisement, the invitation to discuss Christianity is reality. I love that, actually. It's the question and thesis written to our morning together. And reading that when I was invited intrigued me all the more. I took these executives to meet a man in Kentucky several years after we had our initial discussion. I gave them an essay to read by this man named Wendell Berry called The Two Economies. It's a longer essay. The 5-cent version is this. Wherever you look in the world, there's a lesser economy, and then there also is a greater economy. The lesser economy is Pete's business in the prison of Hutchinson, Kansas. Bottom line, yes. Money has to be made, yes. People have to be employed, yes. Pete looks at the numbers year after year to say, we're doing well in this business in the middle of Kansas. He does those questions because that is, in fact, his responsibility as the steward of his company. In various terms, that is a lesser economy. He says, wherever you look in the world, though, there's always a greater economy, too. And the greater economy is what? It's the way the world really is, whether you like it or not, because it's reality. In fact, every smaller business has to eventually bump up against the reality of the greater business, of the reality of the world that really is there. We could tease that out in many thousands of ways, of course, this morning, but I won't do that. But think it through again. Every business you represent in this room, in various terms, is a honest and true, but a lesser economy. The businesses that you operate, you oversee, that you give your lives to, in various terms, live in the world of the greater economy. The greater economy in various terms is what? He calls it reality. Reality. And eventually, every lesser business has to bump up against the reality of reality, the world that really is there. It's quite an interesting idea to have, actually. The chief economist said, can we meet this guy? We flew down to Kentucky to spend a day talking to Wendell Berry at his farm. And the very last thing he said to us, we were driving away, he said, you know, if I were to say one thing, it would be this. If you want to make money for a year, you ask certain questions, don't you? If you want to make money for 100 years, you have to ask other questions. That's true for business, it's true for marriage, it's true, isn't it? The marriage for 100 years, or how about, say, 30 years or 50 years? Different questions simply to be married for 1 year. You make business for 1 year, if all you care about, in and out quickly, well, there's a certain question you have to ask. At various point, if you don't be here for the long haul, to sustain profitability, you're going to have to ask other questions. Well, I would simply say this. It can't be this rethinking of business and business, simply a verse here, a verse there, dancing our way across the peaks of the Bible. Rather, a deeper mining into the very heart of God as He revealed Himself in Scripture. This grand story from creation to consummation. The story of what ought to be, the story of what is, the story of what can be, the story of what someday will be. It's a way of seeing that makes sense of making sense of all of life in the world. Every square inch of it, in fact. Every square inch of the whole of reality. From our most personal relationships to our most public responsibilities. Distinctively and uniquely, and yet also communally and corporately, this story becomes a tapestry of justice and mercy and humility, woven into all that we think and say and do. Its story becoming our story, its way of seeing becoming our way of seeing. Well, we need to bring this to an end. Please hear these words. Can we become as theologically mature as we are professionally competent? It's a question for you, for me, for every one of us. And the way we answer it will be a true reading into what we understand our vocations to be. In fact, of our seriousness about being here this morning. For many years, I've been part of the work of the M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust, a foundation that has for over 50 years given itself to the work of common grace for the common good in the Pacific Northwest, giving away every year over $100 million, often more than that. Most simply said, I serve them as Senior Fellow for Vocation and the Common Good. Several years ago, an annual leadership conference spoke on some of these same themes, about the work of our lives, about what it means for the world. The next morning, 3 men walked up to me, intrigued and puzzled by what I had said. Brothers and Denver natives, each one. They had had a good idea. With entrepreneurial imagination and industry brought a company into being, making more money than they had ever imagined. I still remember the words that morning now. What we hear from the church is, it's too bad you had to make money. At least you get to give it away now. You're asking different questions, though, aren't you? They said to me. You don't think that way, do you? Can we please talk about this? And we did. Yes, we must all ask different questions if we're going to honestly understand the business of business. If our lives and livelihoods, the work of our hands, have become foretastes of the kingdom that comes, of the kingdom that's coming, then our longings and our loves will be differently imagined, rooted in truer truths than the time-worn, compartmentalized, fragmented, business is just business dualism. It didn't work for Newton in the 18th century. It doesn't work for us in the 21st century. Instead, we're talking about reality this morning, about the way the world really is, about the way we really are, and what that means for the marketplace. Can we give ourselves to becoming signposts of the kingdom, of what could be, of what someday will be, reality as it is? I hope so. I pray so. The world needs it to be so.